Politically Speaking with me, Tarun Nangia. Today we discuss an issue which is much in discussion these days, that's of misleading and false advertising. And it's not limited to matters which are in courts. These days we see a lot of people who on YouTube speak about how many times brands mislead consumers, and that is a cause for concern that may or may not lead to a litigation, but it impacts the brand value of a product. If someone goes out and puts out a video which gets 1 million, 2 million views, it's certainly affecting the sales of the product, and companies are very, very aware of these things. And so we also see companies going that extra mile to show to consumers that they care for their health. And that's why we discuss this issue today, because this involves all of us, a very aware consumer, social media, where people get to interact and share views, exchange opinions on products. And that's why these kind of things reveal themselves. That is why we're going to discuss this issue today. I have with me someone who understands this issue in detail and has done a lot of litigation for big corporations, against these kind of big corporations, both that she's appeared for, and she will be able to tell us on this. Let me welcome Advocate Niharika Karanjawala Misra. She is from Karanjawala and Company. Good to see you, Niharika, and looking for some interesting insights on this show.
Absolutely.
At the outset, can you give me an opening comment on the issue of misleading and false ads before we move to a round of questions?
Absolutely. So misleading advertising is really nothing new. It's something that's been relied on for hundreds of years. In fact, we can look back as far as 1889, where things like arsenic wafers were sold to women to try and bring about a pale complexion that was considered, beautiful and romantic at the time. And this was when the negative effects of arsenic were well known, and in fact the paleness would be a result of a depletion of red blood cells as a result of the ingestion, but it was still something that was marketed to women as a beauty standard. So this is really not something that's very new, and every now and then a big scandal of this nature pops up, and they're very interesting cases to see. I think if you would ask anybody what the biggest false advertising scandal in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 decades was, people would say the Volkswagen emissions scandal, where Volkswagen set up their motors to block emissions of nitric oxide only in a controlled setting of test. So the emissions weren't actually being blocked, but they were testing at far lower than they were in reality. And this caused widespread chaos. I believe the impact was approximately 11 million cars sold that eventually had to be recalled, and Volkswagen was really put through the ringer, and a number of charges were filed against top execs there. Then you have other cases, such as back in, I think this was in the 90s, there was Leonard versus PepsiCo, and that there's a very interesting Netflix documentary on that case right now called Pepsi, Where's My Jet, where PepsiCo advertised that if you drank a certain amount of Pepsi and you handed in a certain amount of bottle caps and labels, they would give, you had a slew of prizes to win, and all the cool kids were drinking Pepsi and things like that. And amongst the prizes, the highest prize that they listed was a fully equipped fighter jet, which I mean, it was a ridiculous notion, but it was something they put forward. And this is one of the cases that's studied in basic contract law in the US, because one person making use of the rules that they had put forward on being able to buy certain credits while handing in certain labels, put in a huge investment, bought those additional credits, bought those labels, and presented it and said, all right, now I want the fighter jet I was promised. And there was a huge, massive amounts of litigation. PepsiCo eventually won there, where the courts decided that it was, considering the nature of the prize offered, it wouldn't be something that a civilian would be allowed to use. And as such, it was very evidently a sarcastic and sardonic offer and not really making a genuine offer. So they won in that instance and were not penalized. And then you also have a very famous instance of the L'Oreal clinically proven scandal, where L'Oreal, on, I believe it was its Genifique products, rolled out the term clinically proven in advertising, clinically proven to renew cells and to make you look more youthful in just 7 days. So there they were held liable as well. Proceedings were started and they ultimately settled with the FTC. So there's nothing new about false advertising. In fact, there's a number of ways in which companies advertise falsely. And every few years, we get one of these interesting cases, as has blown up with Patanjali in recent times, where it becomes a very big issue, drawing in a lot of public interest.
I want to ask this question that came out of your answer now.
Yeah.
As lawyers and as a law firm, you also advise clients on, where they may be falling foul of the law. Do you think that, say, in the 80s, you could have got away with making a lot of claims and nobody would bother? But today, with social media, exchange of information, you actually cannot do that. Could you explain where the role of law firms comes in? Because, there is a marketing department who wants to use every trick in the book to sell. They have their own pressures. There is the operations person, the CEO, who wants to ensure that you don't fall foul of the law. There is the legal head of the company who's always scared that you shouldn't go beyond a certain extent. Could you delve into that area a bit?
Absolutely, Tarun. I think caution is more important than ever at this point of time, because as you said, with the advent of social media and the internet, you have at any point of time several million armchair detectives who are ready and willing to check out your claims, right? And you have people who are going to go into it. And even if there is just a startup of this is questionable, could this really be true? It could be something that your company could be delved into. So depending on what your product is, we always advise heavily on the side of caution. And you always have to make sure that even if you're running a tightrope, even if it's a thin line, you have to make sure that you are on one clear side of legal liability. Otherwise, and for companies of this stature, rolling back products or paying out fines can wind up being in the crores, tens of crores, hundreds of crores. It's a massive, massive undertaking. So we always advise immense caution. And as you said, companies' entire legal departments are totally and completely dedicated to this now, and technology actually plays a very interesting role now, because it tends to be, it plays both a positive and a negative role in terms of false advertising, in my opinion, because you have a slight negative insofar as the proliferation is much wider to a much, much wider variety of people. So the potential harm from a misleading ad, especially if it's an ad for a product that is related to the healthcare or well-being of people and can inflict actual harm as opposed to, let's say, actual physical harm and medical harm, as opposed to, let's say, simply defrauding you economically. The proliferation is much wider. You're reaching a much wider belt of people, often people who are in circumstances where they are vulnerable to claims of this nature. They are vulnerable and susceptible. So the average consumer has nowadays, and it's much easier for them to do so nowadays with the internet and with the wealth of knowledge amassed and available to them, both in terms of forums where one can discuss certain things, where one can find answers, and in terms of just looking things up oneself. So technology has certainly played a positive and negative role as far as false advertising is concerned, in my opinion.
One thing that I would like to know is that specifically, if you take the health and well-being industry, that will involve pharmaceuticals, that will involve Ayurveda, Unani, different kinds of homeopathy, and the claims they make. Do you think this industry needs to be extra careful because it concerns the life, the health of the consumer?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think because of the because of the lives at stake and because of the well-being at stake for companies in the healthcare field, it is a much higher responsibility they face. It is a much higher potential damage that can come about as a result of their claims. Lives can be lost, health can be compromised uh, without potential time to turn around, without potential cure. So I certainly feel that they are both at a greater responsibility, and personally I feel that they should be held to an extremely high standard. In the law, really, you have to hold everybody to the same standard. But if I were advising a healthcare or pharmaceutical company or even a cosmetics brand, anything that could affect the health of a person, I would say, because of the human quotient involved, because of the life loss aspect involved, they have to be extra careful. They have to be extra careful because uh, the backlash they face could not just be with regards to potentially defrauding consumers, but also costing them their lives. That is enough to, it destroys lives. It is enough to destroy companies. And if I was in a position where I was advising a company, I would advise massive caution, and far greater caution than in any other field, I would say, just because the loss of human life is such a high potential burden to have to bear if something goes wrong.
I want you to share with the viewers that in recent times the Patanjali case has been much discussed in the media, and the Supreme Court also rejected the apology, given by the MD of the company. Uh, what has happened? Why the Supreme Court, in a sense, is annoyed with them so much, so that they rejected their apology? If you could, explain this in a little bit more detail. Of course, there is a decision in the Supreme Court, but why? What caused the Supreme Court to be so angry that they had to be harsh and deliver the message to this company?
Absolutely. So I think the Supreme Court decided not to be gentle with Patanjali and decided not to be indulgent with them because of the scale of human life involved in this. What the court was ultimately sending out was a message that the well-being of the people and the well-being of the common man trumps absolutely everything else, and that they will consider that at the highest pedestal when looking into any of these aspects. Because with the Patanjali case, there was a duality of things, right? It was several factors that came together. For one thing, Patanjali has repeatedly, as I saw in your earlier with Vaibhav and Malak, as you guys were discussing, they have repeatedly flouted advisories and cautions to not to make baseless claims. They have made statements in front of the Supreme Court itself not to make medically unverified claims, and they have not complied with that. They have willfully gone against it. Secondly, the circumstances we are in is we are coming out of a pandemic situation where we have seen massive loss of life. The cost has been very, very real in terms of the individual. The cost has been very real, and Patanjali has not only disparaged uh, allopathic medicine and Western medicine in a number of instances, even though it is highly advised to go and get the COVID vaccination. These things are highly advised, and these things are for the general good. The government was putting out ads, the government was creating campaigns, they were also putting out radio messages, sending messages to people. They started they made the Cohen app mandatory for certain things because it was so essential that people get this information in the times of a pandemic when massive loss of life was being experienced on every level. At that level, allopathic medicine was disparaged, doctors were disparaged, people were discouraged from seeking out Western medicine, going to hospitals, and they also made the claim incorrectly so, and incorrect in a number of ways, because for one thing, they advertised it as a cure for COVID, which it clearly is not. They advertised it as a cure for one thing, and they also maintained at the launch, I believe they maintained that they had a WHO certification for best practices in medicine, which they did not. It was a false claim. So what you're doing basically is you are reaching out to a population of vulnerable and desperate people who are looking at a pandemic situation. They are seeing their family members die, they are in fear for their lives, and you are manipulating them by telling them, okay, give us your money and you'll be safe, and we'll keep you safe, and we are the only ones that can do it. Western medicine can't do it, it has failed you, we are the only ones that can do this. And a number of other instances also relating to diabetes, relating to high blood pressure. Patanjali seems to have a history of making slightly casual claims about these things, and I think the Supreme Court is sending out the message that it's enough and this is done, and you cannot take the well-being of the citizen for granted in this manner. Coronel, if I'm not mistaken, was also a lower price point drug and was advertised as that, as compared to a lot of other medication available. So what you are really, your main base that you of vulnerable people is India's working poor, who are desperately looking for measures to pull them through a very, very difficult situation. And it was a situation that should not have been taken advantage of in that way and was wrongfully taken advantage of. And I think what the Supreme Court is reinforcing massively is nobody is above the law. As I saw in your discussion with Vaibhav and Malak also, you guys brought up the very good point. So because Patanjali is a company with this duality, it's both a company putting out consumer goods, but it is so closely linked with a spiritual figurehead. It is something that the people are even more likely to believe, especially people, like I said, in vulnerable and desperate circumstances. And that is why I think the court has come down so harshly on them. The court has rightly refused to accept this apology, and the court has rightly said that there needs to be some genuine accountability here. There needs to be some genuine accountability, because I think it's just one too many instances of flouting, instances of not following the advisories given by the Ministry of Ayush, instances of not complying with affidavits put in with the Supreme Court. And at the end of it, all that matters is the potential loss of human life is too high. Because when people are encouraged and when someone is told this is a cure and you take this and it'll cure you, not only are you putting all of your hope in something that is not likely to cure you, but is simply going to act as a supportive immune booster of a sense, but not protect you from the disease that you are seeking protection from and that you were led to believe you were protected from in taking such thing. It is also leading you to a circumstance where you are shunning other forms of help and you are shunning other forms of medication because you have been advised to do so by the same company, by the same spiritual figurehead. And it just becomes a very ugly and complicated and dense situation where the individual consumer finds themselves trapped in a sea of ideas, and ultimately, God forbid, you will find yourself in a scenario where it's too late and you have simply put your faith potentially, God forbid, in the wrong thing. And I think that's why the Supreme Court was so stern with them, because the cost to the individual is simply too high to be taken lightly.
Point well taken. I'm one last question. We have some time, so I want to slide in. Is if you could reflect on the different types of false advertising that is prevalent.
Absolutely. So these are actually really interesting because it's so many kinds and so many ways that incorrect information is slipped in there. You have puffing or puffery, which is basically overstating claims on how good your product is. Things that can't really win. So the best in town, the best in the world. Things that can't really have any type of verification, but imprint on the consumer while watching. You also have instances of things like inconsistent or incomplete comparisons, where you compare to other products, but you compare them only from the perspective of how you are favorably compared to them, not any of the negative comparisons. So you give only a half picture. You rely on a manipulation of terms. You use terms like organic, you use terms like chemical free, you use terms like hospital grade, things that aren't really defined anywhere, and you sort of imply with them a meaning that you put forward, and manipulate the consumer from that perspective. You have other practices like angel dusting, where you advertise that that your product contains a certain a certain chemical or a certain aspect that in larger quantities, in significant quantities, would have a beneficial effect. However, you have not included in those quantities, but you simply say, oh, it now contains such and such, and fail to mention the quantities in which it contains. It is contained, and as such it wouldn't actually have any of those benefits to the consumer, with the exception of some placebo effect benefits, because there's a lot of studies that show that a hyped up terms in advertising do enhance the placebo effect in individuals using those consumer goods. There's also subliminal advertising, which is completely fascinating, which is just a whole different thing, where the product that's being pushed at you is not actually just the product that appears on the screen, but subliminally through hidden video and hidden audio, you are sort of being, let's say, programmed to desire and to purchase that other product. So it's a plethora of things that people use. They also use color comparisons, in the sense that the colors of, let's say, if you're advertising food, the colors are far more vibrant in advertising. It makes produce look riper than it is, fresher than it actually is, things that you're putting out. There's a whole subsect, it's an entire profession of food stylists for photo shoots, for commercials, where if you look up how they shoot this stuff, it's fascinating. In fact, by the end of it, the food is practically completely unedible when they get done with it, because they paint a glaze on with glue, or when they're advertising cereal, in order to make it look fluffy and fresh and not soggy, instead of the milk, they use glue and styrofoam and things like that. So it's very interesting. It's fascinating the number of ways these things can be negotiated and these things can be put forward. And that's why it's so important that the law grows with it, and companies are held to account.
One final question would be: all is fine unless when someday someone decides to land up in court, and then everything becomes comes under the ambit of law.
Absolutely, it's all fine until it's not. Right. And until somebody decides to sue you, and you suddenly find yourself either in the midst of a class action suit, or you find yourself potentially criminally liable if your goods have caused some harm to an individual beyond just a consumer dispute. And that's why it's very important, not just for consumers, but also for, as you said in the beginning, companies who value themselves and value the product that they're putting out, to be very cautious about these things, because it can all come down like a house of cards, and you can soon find yourself before the courts, tied up in potentially years of litigation, and you can find yourself with your brand completely destroyed, because a consumer's faith once lost is pretty much lost forever. So it is very significant, not just from the perspective of safeguarding one's consumers, but also from the perspective of safeguarding one's brand and one's business, that companies are cautious about these things.
Point well taken, and it was an interesting conversation today with you on misleading ads. In part 2, we'll delve into more detail, some cases also. But the overall picture you shared with us was, in the essence, very intriguing, especially the last answer, which I liked, in which you delved into aspects, various types of false advertising. That is something which was very, very interesting to know. Appreciate your joining us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.